Yeah, okay. Well, thanks for having me. I think this is a great setup, and I look forward to your feedback. So the work I have now is very preliminary, and this is sort of a proposal, if you will, for the type of research questions I'm looking into. And I am actually going to focus mostly on data today, since last week we ran a pilot experiment on data sharing and the behavioral questions involving those kinds of transactions. So generally my work is on IP, but data is in some ways a subcategory of intellectual property. And I use the methods of experiments and the theory of behavioral economics to really study it. Okay, so some of the agenda for today. So I'm going to do a little background of data and a little bit of IP in the context of economics. And I'm going to do a mini introduction on behavioral economics, because I know not everyone here does behavioral economics. And I'll propose some research questions, and then I'll present the lab experiment and the pilot that we did last week to sort of address those research questions. And I'll also give some teaser results from last week. And we also have we have like a winner from last week I also want to reveal as well. And then I'll conclude and we can have a lively discussion. Is it on now? Oh, okay, yeah, okay. All right, so the taxonomy of big data. So big data is a very new kind of good from the perspective of economists. And the taxonomy of it really follows what Aya has been working on to sort of categorize data as some type of good for economists to study, because it has some very unique features, which I'll go over. So what does an economist think of when we think of data? And I have a few ways to define it. So first, it's an intangible good. So this is pretty obvious. It's a not physical object you consume, buy, or trade. It's intellectual property. So it's governed by some sort of copyright, or it could be a database right law. So copyright is, you're probably very familiar with it. It's a set of rights that's granted by the government of a certain state that you can enforce if someone steals an idea or intellectual property. Database right is sort of similar. It's not on the content of the idea itself, but it's an entire data set. Data is also an information good, so it's some sort of intellectual content that's used to generate an output. So the information itself isn't sort of the final thing that people consume, but it's used as an input, if you will, to produce something that's commercializable. So that segues into the fact that it's an intermediate good. It's usually used as an input. It's not something that you can consume at the final stage. And just to complete the I list, it's an experience good. I mistyped it on purpose. So it has to be shown to be seen its value. Like if it's not like so the basic example is like a chocolate bar. You see its value when you look at it, but you don't necessarily have to eat it to understand how much it's worth. Whereas data, you have to sort of consume a little bit of it to understand the value of it. So the types of big data, and this also follows work that Aya has done to sort of categorize the types of big data we face. So there's private data, there's public data, so think of the government websites that so in the US we have like the Census Bureau and things like that. And then the open data, that's open source, so free access, so private data is typically paid, and it's very high quality. The contract type for these types of data is usually exclusive. So when one person buys it, the intention is that they're not supposed to sort of share it with other people unless those other people also have some sort of license with the original owner. Public data is free, and it's not exclusive. So you don't. Since everyone can access it, there's nothing wrong, or it's not breaking any contract when you share it with other people. And sort of the same thing with open source. So open's partially exclusive because sometimes you have to have an account with a certain website to access it, so you can share it with other people who are similar to you, but maybe not everyone in the world. Yeah, and all of these data are non-rival, and that means that if I use or consume data, it doesn't prevent the next person from consuming it as well. So it's different, again, from the chocolate bar. If I eat this chocolate bar, obviously another person can't eat that same chocolate bar. So that's what non-rival means for an economist.
So can I just make sure that I understand the distinction you are making between public and open? So public, you can take the data, make a copy, whatever, there's no IP. But open has it's somebody's data who has only chosen to open it up to everybody who makes a contract. A contract may mean that simply they sign on the website. Or do I understand you correctly?
Yeah, exactly. So I can't think of an example right now, but so say you have like an Amazon account. So everyone with an Amazon account can access some sort of open source data that's available on Amazon or on Google. But you have to have an account with that website. So you have to be some sort of customer with the person providing the open source data, even though the data itself isn't something you're directly purchasing.
Okay. Very good.
Okay.
I have a follow-up question actually. So that the like this data, information, knowledge kind of thinking. So is information behaving the same way? Could we categorize information as a kind of with the same type of logic?
So information, I think.
Well, how do you define data? I guess that's
data
the
is a subcategory of information goods. So information can be things like other kinds of intellectual properties. So patents are considered not the information itself, but it's protecting a certain class of information goods, which is different from just data.
How long is data?
Sorry?
How long is data?
How
like,
long?
Yeah, like if you kind of analyze and process it, it actually becomes information.
Exactly, that's the tricky part, and that's why data is so unique, because there's raw information, people collect it and make it into data, but at some point someone consumes it along some production stage and makes it into intellectual property because they put analysis on it and all that. And that's when data is sort of hidden, like you can't track when was the data the value or when was the intellectual effort the value, and in that way data can be hidden because there's other IP that sort of packages it and makes it into something else. Yeah. Any other questions? Okay. So now I'll go over some characteristics of data markets. So that was a great segue. So some unique characteristics of data and why it's so interesting right now for economists. So the first thing is that there's information asymmetry between buyers and sellers, and this goes into the fact that data is an experience good. So sellers who own data by construction know its value because they've seen all of it. But buyers aren't necessarily seeing all the data before they purchase it, because once you see it, then you're technically already consuming it, and the value of it is, why would you pay for it if you've already seen it? So there's information asymmetry. So sellers know a lot, buyers know very little. So sellers can either take advantage of that, or buyers can be very hard to be convinced of its value. And this is important because people make purchasing decisions based on their willingness to pay. They make purchasing decisions based on what they think the quality of the good is. So this information obviously really matters. The information of the value of the data matters. I sort of covered this before, so there's non-rivalry amongst data consumers. If I consume it, yes?
The information asymmetry works around two. So sometimes sellers don't know the value at all.
Yes.
So buyers might get it for free. I have a few practical examples of that.
Yes. Yes, it's a great point. Yeah.
It works another way too.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah.
And then there's a difference between existing data and like streaming data when it's sent immediately as it's born, which is kind of then the seller actually doesn't know the value of that one. It behaves a little bit differently.
Exactly. Yeah, those are great points. Yeah. Mm-hmm. And I sort of covered this before, so there's this paradox that you have to reveal more information for people to make better decisions about what they're purchasing. But for data, as you reveal more information about it, the value actually reduces because you're basically giving it away for free as you're revealing more information about it. Spillovers are easy to do and hard to prevent. So spillovers means that if someone purchases data, it's very easy for that person to sort of copy it and give it to someone else. So it's easy to do because copying something has almost zero cost these days. And it's hard to prevent because technology and intellectual property laws right now just aren't really good at preventing those acts from happening or seeing when they happen. And then finally, it has, in some ways, unsustainable production in a perfectly competitive market. So that means that data it's generally very expensive to collect and curate. But the marginal cost, so that's the fixed cost. The marginal cost of, if 100 person have already purchased this data, the extra cost of selling it to the 101st person is almost zero. That extra cost is zero. So if the marginal cost is so low, how does it, sort of sustain the high fixed costs? So economists would say that it has unsustainable production when the market is perfectly competitive because you can't offset the original cost of collecting the data. Another way of thinking about it is like how do you pay for data and really pay for its value? And so these are just some of the classical challenges to the data market according to classical economics. But today we're going to focus on behavioral economics. So in some ways, I'm just trying to say it's even more complicated. If we consider behavioral anomalies and things that affect decisions with data transactions. So before I go into how to apply that, I'm going to just do a little short introduction on what behavioral economics is. So firstly, it doesn't exist without classical economic theory. So behavioral economists really don't think of themselves as people who are starting a whole new branch of economics. Their role is to come up with modifications and improvements to classical economics, and they don't really, so the long-term goal is that when there's a new behavioral economics theory, they want to fold that into classical economics, and eventually that's no longer behavioral economics, it's mainstream economics. And that's just sort of the history of where behavioral economics is. So classical economics sort of makes very basic but also powerful assumptions about human behaviors and things like rational choices and other things. They expect people to be human calculators, like you're supposed to not make any mental shortcuts when you're optimizing your decisions. So behavioral economics recognizes that people aren't perfectly rationals and they aren't human calculators, but in fact the outcome of markets might actually change depending on things like framing effects, so how an outcome is framed, how the same objective outcome is framed based on the subjective things around it can actually change market outcomes. People make cognitive shortcuts, and people rely on emotions and gut feelings to make decisions, and there are other psychological factors. And then one challenge, or one traditional challenge to behavioral economics is that yes, people might have these influences to their decisions, but maybe on average, if you take everyone, the average person would behave as a classical economist would think that they behave. Behavioral economics says no, maybe on average these things actually do matter. So it's hard to prove that, but that's sort of the debate. So we're going to focus mostly on the framing effects. So when you have the same outcome, and depending on how it's framed, people might make different decisions. So so I already defined that. So I'll do an example of a framing effect. So suppose you have scenario A and scenario B, and these are in alternate universes. Today you have $0 in scenario A, or sorry, yesterday in scenario A you had $0. Today you gain $100, so today you have 100 euros, not dollars, sorry. And then in scenario B, yesterday you had 200 euros, today you lost 100 euros, and today you have 100 euros. So today you have 100 euros, it's the same for scenario A and B. And classical economic theory, we use these utility functions to sort of map some objective object onto what we call utils. So you can think of it as level of happiness or just some ordinal preference ranking. So classical economics would say that in either A or B, the utility you get from 100 euros today should always be the same value. So A and B would have the same utility value for 100 euros today. So behavioral economics says actually there might be two different utility values. So for the same object, it maps onto two different feelings, depending on how the object is framed. So in scenario A, the idea is maybe you actually are happier here in scenario A than you are in scenario B because, well, in scenario A, you gained something, you never lost anything. And in scenario B, you had to lose something to get to 100 euros. And that's what we call loss aversion. And I'll do just some quick graphs for those of you that are interested. So classical utility, like I said before, maps some object onto utility one-to-one. That usually looks something like this. Behavioral economics sort of takes away this idea of utility and says, actually for the same object, we can have very different utilities, or they call them values. And just to be clear, this whole graph sort of represents one dot on the original classical utility function. So I won't go too much into that, but it just shows like how different people think about utility depending on if you're looking at it from a behavioral economics perspective or just the classical perspective. Okay, so now the applications of framing effects. There's something called the endowment effect, and then also something that I'm trying to explore called the creator effect. So the endowment effect, firstly, is that maybe sellers value data more than buyers simply because there's ownership, all else equal. And then what I'm looking at is, in addition to that, there might be a creator effect. So sellers who are not only owners but creators of their own data might actually value more simply due to creatorship on top of ownership. There's something called the curse of knowledge. So this is a little bit different. So if sellers know more information about, say, their data because they own it, it's hard for them to understand the perspective of a buyer who's never seen the data. So why this is interesting is that in classical theory, the more information you know, the better your decisions should be. And this is sort of a contradiction of that. This means that the more information you know, the harder it is for you to forget that information and see the perspective of someone who has never seen that information. And in that case, it might be that you make worse decisions because you can't unlearn something you already know. And then finally is just status quo bias. So people sort of make decisions maybe that won't be their best choice, but they do it because it's what has always been done. Maybe there's some inertia, some momentum issues, and maybe they're doing it because it's what other people are doing. So we can start thinking about this issue with things like data sharing. So if it's easy to copy a data set and give it to someone else, maybe because it's what other people are doing, not necessarily because it's your best choice. Okay, so some research questions related to the application of behavioral economics onto data sharing. So first is the endowment effect. So does data valuation depend on rights assignments? So who the owner is, does that matter for market outcomes? The creator effects is similar, but it's saying that in addition to ownership, does creatorship matter in market outcomes? Curse of knowledge, does knowing more prevent data owners from predicting how potential buyers value that same data? And then contract effects is something we're sort of exploring. It's, does something about the contract language affect data sharing outcomes? Okay, so as promised, I'm going to discuss the lab experiment that we did a pilot of last week. So lab experiments are sort of these really controlled, somewhat artificial environments that try to mimic the real world, but obviously it's very hard to do so. So in a controlled environment, you can have a treatment group and a control group, and with randomization, on average, you expect people to behave the same, except for the extra effect that the treatment gives the treatment group. Whereas in the real world, it's actually very hard to find these natural experiments, which is why we do behavioral experiments, because behavior is even harder to sort of find experiments of in the real world. So the first thing that lab experiments need is to have like a toy model of the market or the good that's being transacted. And in this case, it's data. So we didn't use real data in the real world, but we wanted to sort of model it in a toy model and see how people behave around it. So the thing we did was we used a text scraping exercise. So using readable text and scraping information out of that readable text and constructing some sort of value on top of the data. So some way that people can use this data to earn money in some way. So yeah, so there's original readable text, there's raw information. We use two kinds of data. That's text scraped from the original raw information. We used open source data, which is sort of a low quality level data. Proprietary data, which is high quality, and we made the open source data free for all the people in the lab, and then proprietary data had to be a purchased good for people in the game. And then we structured this market where data can be exploited to recreate the original text, and that's how potential data buyers would earn money. And then, so we'll do a little illustrative example of what it looks like for those of you who weren't there last week. So sellers own proprietary data. So they have some sort of raw information and then they have also access to open source data, but also they own their proprietary data on that raw information. Buyers don't see any raw information, but they do see open source data, and they have the option to purchase proprietary data. And they're tasked with recreating the original text. And here's just an illustrative example of how a buyer might recreate the original text. And then how it's evaluated, or how people earn money off of it, is seeing how many words are correct and how many words are incorrect. And the number of correct words sort of earns the buyer money. So there's an incentive to be accurate and use good data. So any questions? All right. Okay. So the type of treatments or agents in the game that we had were obviously, I don't know if we can, now we can see everything. Okay. So obviously we have sellers and buyers, which I sort of went over before. One other thing is that the seller has full information. So this comes into the information asymmetry that we're trying to model. Buyers have partial information, and the way we did this was sellers had like 15 minutes to sort of look at their data and really inspect it and really try to understand it. Buyers only had 1 minute to look at proprietary data or preview proprietary data before they buy it. Both people, we elicit minimum willingness to accept and maximum willingness to pay prices. And then we also did a second level of treatments. So sellers were randomly split into owners and creators. So owners were sort of just endowed proprietary data and told them that this is theirs. Creators were asked to create their own proprietary data. And then buyers were also assigned into two different types of contracts, and these are contracts they don't see at the first stage. So before they make pricing decisions and valuation decisions, they don't see the contract. But if they purchase it, then they either get an unrestricted contract or a restricted contract. And the only difference between those two contracts is that the restricted contract has the word only, so only you can use this data, whereas unrestricted contracts say you can use this data. And everyone was sort of told that there's no economic penalty for sharing data or collaborating with others and looking at other people's data. So the outcome variables that we measure from the lab experiment, first is this valuation of open source data. So sellers evaluate open source data after they've seen the raw information. Buyers evaluate, obviously, without viewing the raw information. So we can think about whether or not, if there's a gap, maybe it's something to do with the curse of knowledge. So sellers saw something original, and then maybe that affects their valuation of open source data. Okay, so and then there's the valuation of proprietary data. So the sellers evaluate for 10 to 15 minutes, and buyers evaluate for 1 minute. And then we have probably the most important variable is the willingness to accept and willingness to pay. So sellers determine a minimum amount they're willing to accept to sell their data. So for those of you who are in the lab, if you remember, it was a demand schedule of 100 euros to 0 euros with $5 increments. And at every stage, the seller is asked, if the price is 95 euros, would you accept it and sell it? And the seller would check yes or no for every price level. And we do that usually in behavioral lab experiments because it cleanly elicits people's true minimum, or in the buyer's case, a true maximum, because there's no incentive to sort of lie. And it helps people really, if you look at every price, it helps people understand, okay, and think about, their demand curve, instead of, just saying, okay, 25 euros is my minimum, and that's it, because it's hard for people to think of that decision that way. And for those of you that, yeah, go for it.
No, just the middle point is valuation. The distinction between the times is the two. So you intend to model with that the sellers know much more, that this imbalance of information.
Yeah.
Right.
Mm-hmm. And this, depending on, and this can always change, because who knows what 2 minutes is, and 1 minute, how is that different from 2 minutes for buyers? Who knows? It's very structured in that way. Okay, and then we had some final survey questions at the end after people sort of took the time to do the task, that is recreate the original text. We asked them, actually before they do it, how likely they are to share their data. And then after they sort of recreate the task and they may or may not have worked with people around them, they sort of reveal whether any data was shared in the recreation process. So any questions before I reveal some preliminary results?
So was there any impact on the kind of economic side for the buyers for sharing the information? So what was the kind of the end goal for them?
So the end goal for them is to earn money by recreating as many words of the original text as possible. But they obviously also if they paid for data, they lose.
Yeah. Was there supply-demand type of setup for the end? More offers lower price type of thing, or was it equal for independent of how many actually got the right answers?
Yeah, it's independent. It's not competitive at all. Okay. So for both sides, so buyers only got one proprietary data option, and then when they did this recreation task, it wasn't in competition. So everyone could potentially earn 100 euros from recreation.
If kind of the sharing of the information is then dependent on that, what is the kind of the economical outcome of their actions.
Yeah. So it's only, in some ways, it's only upwards if you share. Yeah. There's no penalty for it. Okay, so our game last week had 16 participants, and we split the session up into, the first session was everyone played the role of a seller, second session everyone played the role of a buyer. So 16 sellers, 16 buyers, and then in the buyer session we paired everyone into little groups, but they didn't know that when they made valuation decisions, only when it was the recreation stage that they knew that they were sitting next to people that they could possibly work with. Okay, so the first survey question was the confidence that someone can recreate the text using open source data. So one of the learnings we got from the game was that sellers interpreted average person to mean average layperson, so anyone in the world. Buyers were asked this question in the context of their own abilities. So there's a little bit of a difference in the framing here, and we'll try to crack that in future experiments. One way of thinking about it is that most people think that their capabilities are better than the average person, or the average person has lower capabilities than them. So you see that sellers have a little bit higher confidence than buyers, but we can think of it as a little bit conservative. The gap, it could be a little bit conservative. And I don't have any standard errors here because the sample size is so small, but just to get a taste of what the point estimates might look like.
What's the scale?
What's the scale?
Yeah, for these 3.44.
Oh yeah, so it's between a 0 and a 10. Mm-hmm. And the way the questions were asked was, it was technically 10 questions for this. So the first question is, how confident do you feel that an average person can recreate 10% of the text, and you rank your confidence. And then 20% of the text, you rank your confidence, and the averages are taken over all of those. Yeah. Okay, so the same question was asked for proprietary data. So this is actually in addition to open source data. So they know everyone has access to open source data. So now on top of that, if they also have access to proprietary data, what is the confidence in completing the task? So sellers and buyers were very, very similar. And I also split it up into creators and owners, because at this stage, proprietary data is a little different depending on who you are. So creators created their own proprietary data. Sellers were endowed of proprietary data. Interestingly enough, I don't know if this will reflect a bigger scale game, but creators had somewhat of a lower valuation of their own creation. And then when it came to becoming a buyer, I also tracked whether or not they were former creators in the first session. So former creators had very higher valuations of proprietary data that they could potentially buy. Just a little subtraction there.
That's interesting.
Yeah, so it could be maybe lower confidence, or lower confidence, or there's this idea that, oh, I don't want to show hubris or arrogance. I'm going to rank my own self-report or self-grade my own thing a little bit lower. So the point is that these confidence numbers aren't incentive compatible, because there's no incentive to be really honest with the accuracy or be good at predicting the accuracy. It's sort of just a preliminary survey question. Yeah. Okay, so another way I did it was that, so suppose, a confidence 3 means something different for everyone in the room. So for the same person, I just subtracted their confidence numbers for proprietary data with open source data. So maybe the gap has more meaning than the absolute value. And it shows something a little bit different. So the interesting behavior of creators is even is even more obvious now. Is that the case? Yes. Oh no, I apologize. So creators actually, if we do it this way, the difference between their proprietary data they created and the open source data, there's a wider gap. So there's a stronger marginal benefit for creators. And if we look at the buyers' side, the former creators also sort of have that same gap. Okay. And any questions? Okay, so now that here comes the incentive compatible valuation decisions. So it's that demand schedule of prices, and that sort of in some ways reveals what they believe to be the value of data. So the seller average minimum willingness to accept was around 55 euros. Creators were 53 euros, owners were 57. So maybe that also brings in the interesting issue of why creators value something they created a little bit lower than someone who's just endowed data. The buyer maximum was around 51 euros. Former creators actually had much higher willingness to pay, which is 55. Former owners had much lower willingness to pay. And if we look at the difference, on average it's a €4 difference. So creators actually, there is no gap, or there's a gap the opposite way, which means that there is a market clearing price that exists within about €2. But owners, actually the gap is pretty big, at 10 euros. So in this 10 euro case, that means that the sell price and the buy price don't overlap. So technically there's no transaction possibly for those cases. Any questions?
I guess like
Yeah.
Maybe about this willingness to, for the sellers, the valuation of the sellers for their own creation, how much they were willing to accept as a price from the buyers. So maybe it has to do now with the type of the text, which is rather specific.
Mm-hmm.
So maybe they think that they don't know as well the substance.
Ah, okay, for creators.
Yeah.
Yeah, that's a really good point. Yeah. So typically creators or inventors are experts in their field. Yeah.
But now in this case,
Mhm.
they felt unsure.
Yeah, yeah. And then there are other actually other lab experiments that have explored this creator issue, and they don't see an effect when people are sort of just given, okay, now you're creating, and this is what you're going to do. But when people were actually experts in their fields and told to create, the creator effect goes the opposite way. So there's a higher valuation for their creation that they have a strong understanding of.
Yeah.
Yeah.
just a tiny thing, so you're coloring and then so on. So actually, I guess what you're saying is that the creators actually can make a deal.
Yes, the coloring is a little
but the owners have a $10 or euro gap. So
Yeah.
that's-
Yeah, it should be, the colors are a little off. So it's like good for me because I'm looking for an effect, so that's why I did green, I guess.
Yeah.
But for the real world, it should, the $10 is a bad thing. It's the lack of transactions is, really inhibits innovation in some ways.
I'm not sure how the game make the distinction between creators and owners, even though I was playing it. So how did that distinguish? Who were the creators? Who were the owners?
Oh, they were randomly assigned.
Okay.
Yeah.
So the creators then had a little bit different set.
Yeah. So they're
played with.
yeah.
Okay, then
Yeah.
I understand.
Yeah. So in practice, what happened was that the 15 minutes for a task, some people spent those 15 minutes to inspect data that was given to them.
Okay.
And then creators spent those 15 minutes doing some circling with words. So they created their own data set by circling words in the original text that they would want to keep.
Okay,
And
I
so
see.
They
Very
spent
good.
15 minutes doing that.
Very good.
Yeah.
I failed to notice that, but I was
Yeah, well, that's good.
within the
You're-
game, not out.
Yeah, you're not
Okay.
supposed to know what other
Yes,
people. Yeah.
yes, I wasn't supposed to know.
Yeah.
Yes, I see.
Hmm.
I'm just wondering because there were a bunch of different people, and some were really knowledgeable about the specific context, which of course in some sense makes it easier to extract value out of the text,
Yeah.
even if they see only this partial
Definitely.
So they brought a bit of background knowledge to the scene,
Yeah.
whereas others wouldn't. But that may possibly was averaged out, so didn't affect the outcome too much.
And
We
is that the case
also
anyway?
marked.
And that is the case in every game, of course, that people have various backgrounds and.
Yeah, but we know who were the academic people and who were industry people, so we have also marked that.
Okay, I see. So you can extract that effect if you want. That's good. Very, very nice.
And I think it did matter, at least maybe we can't really see how it mattered for the sellers, but for the buyers, it was pretty obvious. Some people didn't have access to data and they were able to recreate like 70% of the text. So it was, some people did have really good knowledge of what the text was about. Okay, so for the collaboration or data sharing stage, so this is the stage where people got together and recreated the original text after they may or may not have purchased data for it. So about 50% of the participants ended up purchasing proprietary data. And the prices were randomly assigned. So each person was randomly given a price. So say 45 euros is someone's randomly assigned price. And then in their survey sheet, they marked, well, if it is for 45 euros, will I buy or not buy? And we made purchasing outcomes based on matching those. So only one purchaser out of the 8 shared their data. And this was under an unrestricted contract, which means that the contract never specified you were not allowed to share it with other people. The purchase price was actually pretty low, so 20 euros. And in their exit survey, they revealed that the price that they purchased did affect their decision to share their data. 7 purchasers did not share their data. And they were sort of split between unrestricted contracts and restricted contracts, and their prices were in the range of 30 euros to 55 euros. And most actually disagreed that price influenced their sharing choice. And those who didn't disagree just marked not applicable or not sure. Okay, and then the other half of participants ended up not purchasing proprietary data. 4 of those participants collaborated with another without proprietary data. So this means that whoever they were seated next to also didn't have proprietary data. So they both had access to the same open source data, and so they collaborated to sort of do the recreation task. One person collaborated with a proprietary data owner, so that was the 20 euro data, and it was also the unrestricted contract. And then 3 people did not collaborate with someone who had proprietary data. So these 3 people didn't have proprietary data, and they didn't work with someone who had proprietary data. And it was a mix between restricted and unrestricted contracts. Yeah, and then the reason for collaboration or non-collaboration is very varied. So in ex ante, before anything happened, some people said, oh, we're likely to share. Some people said we're very not likely to share or collaborate. And then at the end, everyone sort of didn't collaborate. But their reason for that sort of varied. Most of them said, well, the price didn't factor into that decision. So maybe we can just explore, or maybe you can reveal the reason. Maybe it's something to do with, if someone tells you not to do it, maybe you just don't do it. Or if the contract says don't do it, maybe, you don't do it. So, yeah.
Following the rules.
Yeah, following the rules.
Like the good Finns. Normiohjautuva. Norms regulated Finns.
Yeah.
The thing was
They
that
do
the
what is regulated.
interesting thing was that even in the unrestricted room, there was only the one
Exactly, yeah.
that worked together.
Yeah.
But it was cheaper than the
Yes.
rest.
Finns are very solitary.
Yeah.
Was it considered low value, monetary value, so then it's easier to share?
Potentially.
I don't think that the value had anything to do with the price.
Yeah, maybe not, yeah.
Or the price, lower price logic, so.
At least if you look at the cultural, let's say, comparisons between
Yeah. Mhm.
how Finns are in this classification, for
Yeah.
example, the Hofstede.
Yeah. And they weren't playing also with real money. It's all hypothetical money, so
Yeah.
the price might actually have like a low effect on decisions. Even though, well, people were told to try and make decisions based on as if the money is real, but it's really hard to do that without real incentives. Yeah.
But of course, this incentive to recreate the text.
Yeah. Yeah.
Maybe
Yeah.
could have been a little bit emphasized more than
Yeah. Maybe.
why.
Right.
I don't know.
Okay, so now I have some information on earnings winners from the game. So seller winners, so this is sort of like a random draw. It's not really based on any decisions other than your willingness to accept decisions. So I don't have real names here, but Sansa 2 and Granger 2 both got 55 euros. Third place is Coast 1, which is 40 euros. So buyer winners is the more interesting one because this comes with the random price purchases, but also recreation, so some effort that they made. So Pippin 2 got 73 euros, Pippin 1 had 53, and Gandalf 1 had 42. And so the overall winners, so first place was Sansa 2, who actually didn't buy proprietary data at all. And then second place was Granger 2, really close second, 83 euros, and third place was Pippin 2, 73 euros.
And the interesting thing is that the Pippins were the only pair that collaborated.
Interesting, yeah. Yeah.
I mean, the only pair that got data and collaborated.
And
that's the-
collaborated, yeah.
Yeah, price difference
Mhm.
of what they got.
All right, so that's sort of the end of the presentation part, but we can go on to discussion or.
So was there something that surprised you, or did this go according to your expectations, or sort of gut feeling that this is?
Yeah, it actually went way better than expected. So students, I usually work with students in the lab and I pay them like $15 or whatever. And they're it's hard to get them to take things seriously. So they really just want to take the money and leave, and they don't sit down and really consider survey questions and take the time to make decisions. In the game last Thursday, everyone was very serious and they took the survey questions very seriously and really considered the decisions that they made. So that was a huge, like it wasn't a surprise, but it was like a huge benefit for us because it really matters when people take the time to make decisions. And it's probably a factor of you guys aren't undergraduate students and these maybe reflect real life decisions that you are faced with.
But if you interpret the results, I mean, with the eyes of behavioral economist, did you see something unexpected or surprising, or did?
Yeah, I think the how creators behaved is unexpected in some ways, and I think it's the issue that Rita brought up, that they aren't necessarily experts in the field.
Yes.
So the expectation is that creators should have the highest bias on their own creation. But maybe creators isn't just about creating something, it's about being a certain type of person, so being an expert.
So it's more an expert effect now.
Expert, exactly. Yeah, we should probably have to rename it now. Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
Yes.
Yeah.
And of course, you can still track if those creators were the academics
Yeah. Yeah.
or the industrialists.
Yeah.
They could track that.
Yeah. Yeah, we can look into that.
Yeah, because it would be even more understandable if the academicians would be uncertain of their creation.
Yeah.
That would be those industrialists who have themselves been providing the knowledge for the things.
Right, right. Mm-hmm.
Yeah. So it was highly interesting. So the instrument itself is quite complex. It has a different, ideas behind, and the set of the surveys contains many seals, and the phases were strict, and people were concentrating. So it was
Yes, coming back to
1.5
that, now
hours.
with this experience, what is your feeling about the instrument? Something you'd like to change or develop further, or how you would run the experiment next time if you were given a similar audience?
Yeah, I think I would focus more on the collaboration stage because there's some interesting behaviors there, I think. So economists would say, like, you know, depending on this unrestricted contract or restricted contract, people shouldn't behave differently because there's no, I mean, it's just the way something's worded, but there's no actual impact. So it's, you know, the wording of something, if that is so influential in how people behave, like that could be really important in contract languages. Because that's a real issue with data sharing. Because right now, in most cases, there's no way to penalize people for copying data or track people for copying data. But maybe if there's an extra effect in contract language, and that if that nudges how people behave, that could be important. Actually, like when I first got to Finland, I opened up Facebook and there was this huge red banner. I don't know if everyone gets this, but there's this huge red warning over Facebook saying that there are cookies that track everything you do. And in the US, that just doesn't exist. So that could be like a real life, in some ways not, it's about personal data and it's about privacy, but it's something very similar.
That's according to European privacy law.
Okay, yeah.
It's compulsory.
European regulation demands that. It's been now in effect for, I don't know, a year or so.
Yeah.
You kind of get desensitized to it because it's on every page. It's more like an annoying ad that you have to dismiss.
Yeah, but I think that's important because I started considering, you know, when I had Facebook open, when I didn't, and most people don't know that Facebook tracks your browsing activity, but then I've sort of looked at the terms and conditions, and now that it's like told, it's there every time telling me this is what's happening and reminding me, then I sort of behave differently with revealing personal data. Yeah.
For a while.
Yeah, for a while.
Well, you could run an experiment
Yes,
to
that
reveal
practice.
what is the difference. It might be difficult to make, but I think also that it makes a difference.
Yeah.
It may wear off eventually, I don't know. But,
Yeah.
One thing that comes to mind is kind of how much bias there is, because first you add in one row and then immediately in the other, and then the third round you kind of take your experience. So running that kind of experiment with independent
Exactly.
rules would be
Yeah.
give more probably non-biased, because I think considering people's behavior, I know the previous one, so now I
Yeah.
do this.
Yeah, that's really important. So typically we run experiments in independent groups. So buyers and sellers should be two separate groups. Like creators and owners, and then also there's two buyer groups. So yeah, there's much more independence. And yeah, and the results could be different. And it could be that, you know, because I was a seller in the first stage, I remember the price, and so that primes my decision as a buyer for my price. Whereas if I've never seen prices before as a seller or a buyer, then I might choose differently.
The texts were different for
Yeah, the text was
Yeah,
different.
so
Yeah.
it was not the same object you were selling and buying.
Mhm.
So that we had two different texts, original.
Yeah.
So in that sense.
I must confess that during the game I had difficulty to think about the average person trying to decipher the text. I mean, average person equipped with IBM Watson,
Yeah.
for instance.
Yeah.
Because actually when you see every fifth word as the open source text was set up, but you also see that the punctuation, you get a pretty good feel about the length of the words that are hidden. Then it's not too difficult a task to start generating plausible texts that fit that pattern, and then have a bit of AI judging what is the level of plausibility of each, and selecting a few winners. And so what I'm simply saying is that the actual recognition task is probably not too difficult
Okay.
for the average person who has unlimited computing resources and IBM Watson and whatnot.
Yeah.
But then it comes down to what is average and how many resources you are willing to put into that, and of course spending $1,000 to reveal $100 text does not make economic sense. And then I stopped thinking about that, because then the whole reasoning gets too complicated. That was way beyond the game anyway.
Yeah.
So these resources resources needed to study the, I mean,
Yeah. And-
that's
Yeah.
sort of probably not intended by you to be part of the setup.
Yeah, but it could be done because you could just tell buyers, now you're randomly endowed some computer, some fake hypothetical computer, and we're going to take this data, put it in the computer, and then something will come out.
Yes.
It's like it's very artificial.
But it should
can
be then
done.
given in the survey, I mean.
Yeah.
But
Then
as
it
an
gets-
average person without a computer, it was
But then
meant.
it gets tricky because that's not free. I mean, are you willing
Yeah.
to pay
Yeah.
$10 to find
Yeah.
$5 worth
Yeah,
of text?
yeah.
Probably
It's a
not.
lot of-
So,
yeah.
Depending if you can use the text then in a better way.
For a very, very.
Yes.
And then 15 or
Here you go. So
High
you can model and model, and it gets more and more
Yeah.
complex.
But it gets too complex then, estimation then, so.
Mm. Yeah.
Yes.
So we have been thinking about this average person.
Yeah, we've been thinking about how to word that better
Yeah.
to make it at least the same as
Uh,
from the buyer's perspective.
Uh-huh.
So in some ways, asking a seller, if you were a buyer, how
Mhm.
likely would you
Yeah,
recreate?
yeah.
So maybe something like that.
Also, yeah.
Yeah,
So to have a similar, let's say,
yeah,
subject.
yeah.
there.
And we just want the framing to be different, but the subject should be the
Yeah,
same.
the same.
Other than that, I find that this model was pretty clever. How you model this open source creator function. That was quite cool.
Oh, okay. Cool. Thanks.
We were discussing also this scraping as a metaphor. Because actually what you were doing, you were kind of scraping out those words who were visible and keeping in the dark those that were not. So scraping is kind of revealing that
Like scraping this lottery tickets,
Yeah.
they reveal
So
the
like
hidden
raputtaa
numbers.
arpa. So and scraping the text means actually it's kind of the negative, so to say, photography. Yeah. So how to word it? But I think with the visual explanations that we had in the game, it was quite obvious what was meant. Or was it?
Yes, it was, I think.
Yeah.
It was very clearly set up.
Okay.
So
Yeah.
coming back to the follow-up, I mean,
Yeah.
what you have now learned from this experiment, and so you said that okay, this sharing aspect that might be interesting to somehow study further, perhaps develop. But anything else that you think you have learned from this experiment that you would then like to apply in the next one?
Yeah, I mean, I still think that endowment effect is relevant for intellectual property goods. So I didn't mention this before, but endowment effect is typically studied with tangible objects like mugs and pens and baseball cards, and they're substitutable and non-rival. And there's always a theory that there is an endowment effect because people have loss aversion. So if when you sell something, you lose it, and that's why there's an endowment effect. In intellectual property and data, like, you don't lose knowledge when you license it. So it's something a little bit different that might explain the endowment effect. Maybe it's something about ownership bias, or in some cases it's just the way that the price is framed for buyers and sellers. So sellers, for patents at least, they gain royalties, so they gain some positive amount. But buyers think about payments in the negative, so they have some revenues and they delete parts of those revenues to pay as royalties. So even that might be a framing effect that causes an endowment effect.
Then we talked about maybe another experiment where we could control for the background knowledge of the people better, or
Yeah.
like have the industrialists together and so on, to look at the knowledge that is
Yeah.
behind to control a little bit of that, and also to understand this
Yeah.
creator.
The creator side is
Yeah.
something it's very hard to do that in a lab setting. So that's probably something that we'd have to look into, something in the real world, either field experiments or like real natural experiments in the real world.
Even this test, it probably would be, I don't know if you could tabulate the results according to to background, say information academia. It was
Mhm.
probably more or less half and half. Well,
Yeah.
whatever it was, but
Yeah,
you
maybe I
could
can
probably
tell
do
you.
this tabulation and see whether it makes any distinction.
Yeah.
Then the assumption is that industry people have more background knowledge and it somehow influences their decisions.
Yeah.
But the thing is that in this case there were some academic people who knew more about the case than others, and maybe some of the industry had been more involved in than others.
Yes, it gets blurred.
Yeah,
I
yeah.
know, I know, I
Yeah.
know.
Yeah.
Have you thought about gamification? Like, I can see that this is pretty close to kind of these closed rules, what you actually can use to build a game out of this one. Just a kind of way to do the simulation or the experiments. So
Oh, what do you mean by gamification?
gamification, so turn this into a game. So I don't know, have you had a look at the Nikki case today, this game theory game called Trust? If you haven't, so have a look.
No.
So he actually built a kind of the game theory model into this simple game where you actually kind of behave in different roles and so on. So there's actually like, there might be some potential in this to turn into a game. Because if you
interesting.
do that,
Yeah.
then you would kind of get, of course, much more exposure and
Yeah. It could be an online
Yeah, online
experiment
game
then.
type of
Oh
thing.
yeah, that would be cool. Yeah, I'll have to look into that. Yeah.
I was also thinking about this, that could be turned online because they can control how long a time you can see and take
Yeah.
and so
Yeah.
on. So the steps are really
Yeah.
and this kind of being a creator, doing something and so
Yeah.
on. So you're pretty close on this
Pretty
kind
close.
of with the rules on having a game there.
yeah, then you would have maybe bigger N
Yeah.
sample.
Yeah. 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 So I guess the next stage is to roll it on to a computer. Instead of,
Yeah.
we had paper surveys for this round, but yeah,
Yeah.
usually computer
Yeah.
surveys are the next step.
And the whole thing could be with all the instructions and
Yeah.
cases.
Mm.
Mhm.
There's another question in the back. I think I missed.
Yeah, I was just thinking about that kind of game. I was playing that into like we were a pair having a conversation of that well, we have a logical conversation of upsides and downsides, and we ended up that there are no downsides.
Yeah.
So the logical conclusion was that we do
Yeah.
things together
Yeah.
because we both would a lot, most
Yeah.
probably.
Yeah.
But do you have any idea of the reasons why the other persons didn't do that? Because we fall into that in practice
Mhm.
when we have negotiations with customers.
Mhm.
My theory, I'm guessing, is that it's a risk management. They don't know enough about the environment. So
Mhm.
to make sure that they don't lose anything, they just say that I don't want to share.
Yeah. Yeah.
Because there's the risk of losing. But when we had that conversation that what we can win, what we can lose, and then made a logical conclusion, then it was easy
Yeah.
to do the sharing.
Yeah. That's really
That-
interesting.
That
yeah.
was the first 5 minutes what we have
Yeah.
out of that what do we do, what we win, what we would lose.
Yeah.
Mm.
Oh. Well, yeah.
That's very rational.
It was also
Yeah.
interesting that there were several like pairs around you who would kind of see that you were collaborating, but they still didn't collaborate.
Yeah.
And like there were pairs that had, because if a pair got proprietary texts, they would have different proprietary texts each. So if they would combine those, they would get even more words. But they didn't.
Yeah. It's interesting.
In
Oh,
which
there
room
were
were
different
you
versions
sitting?
of the proprietary.
In the bigger, in the
I
kitchen,
know
or in the
those
kitchen?
In the
Okay.
kitchen side,
Yeah.
By the way, one thing on this kind of whole setting before this one, so I had a bit hard time on thinking at what is your approach. So I've been working on this question on the industry setting,
Mm.
and there this kind of novelty value actually is pretty important as well. So yes, you have kind of accumulated knowledge, which I guess this is a demonstration of. But then you have this, like I said, raw data stream.
Mm.
And it doesn't matter who kind of, if I don't get it right now, it doesn't have any value anymore. If you think of stock markets, so that you know that if you go to London Stock Exchange, all the computers around the central server are at equal length, so that the cables are the same size. But you're not to give any advantage to any of the operators.
Yeah.
So that their kind of the value is about kind of who gets the information
who gets it
first.
first. Yeah, that's really interesting.
And it's kind of, you don't know the value of the information. It's just a kind of.
Oh, okay.
So it's
Yeah.
but it's a different setting and so on.
Yeah.
But this is kind of what we see in the IoT, for example, right now. So we get the equipment data out of the devices. So they have the value of kind of accumulated knowledge what is going on, but there's the immediate value of kind of, is it breaking down right
Oh,
now?
okay.
So that so that's a little bit different setting.
Yeah,
So
yeah.
that's-
Interesting. You have two very different types. So the
Yeah.
timing is like that.
So it's
the
kind of-
non-rivalry really matters. Like other people can see it.
Yes.
Really matters.
This is
Yeah.
more of a kind of database perspective in that
Yeah.
sense. A database kind of, what do
Yeah.
you do?
And it's very specialized
Yes.
for the specific task. You know what to do with it.
Yeah.
Hmm.
So we were building these kind of real-time data marketplaces, so that there are people who want to buy this kind of, that how often do I flush my toilet type of information. So
Wow,
that
yeah.
there's value for actually many different parties for that kind of information. But then kind of that there's statistical value for that one as well, but you actually need to know that from the operative perspective. So that
Mhm.
and this was US, that the Super Bowl commercial breaks are nightmare for the water companies.
Yes. I was actually wondering during the test whether this real-time aspect was part of your design, because there was not really enough time to do the deciphering, the final part.
Mhm.
And so you could, well, I was thinking that perhaps, I don't know if you meant it like this, but perhaps you had in mind that there was this real-time aspect, that you have to do the job by a certain deadline, and after that it loses value entirely.
Yeah.
And
Yeah,
then it
but-
of course creates a strong incentive, or may create a stronger incentive to data sharing or whatever tricks you can do.
Using money
Shortening the cable,
using money
if you
so
like.
yes, using money to
Using
get-
money
yes.
to help it out. But I was not sure if it was part of your design or whether it was just an accident that we didn't have more time.
Oh,
there was
oh.
actually one pair that was asking that can I use money to buy
buy
more time?
buy time.
Oh, they were very clever.
Yeah, yeah.
But we
Because
said
they
no.
brought this real-time aspect very.
Yeah.
So was that part of your design?
Yeah, in some ways it is. Like, well, there's the administrative issues that we have to have a certain
Of
amount
course.
of time. But then usually, yeah, we have timed activities. So in this experiment, we had 10, 15 minutes for recreation, and that's it. And it's how much you can earn in that 15 minutes that counts, and
Okay.
not how much you could potentially earn after the 15
Yes.
minutes.
So it was
Yeah.
a kind of real-time.
Yeah.
Will be
Yeah.
this real-time setting.
Yeah. Yeah.
Very
So-
good. Well, then it was fine, and then it's of course natural that the task is that most people don't have the time to complete it entirely, which I did.
Yeah. Yeah, and then the task is like you can still earn money if you don't finish the whole thing.
Of course,
So-
yes, you can do a good partial job.
If you want to dig deeper on this kind of real-time data thing, so look at news. So
Yeah.
the value of news type of thing.
Oh,
So
okay.
that's where you get a kind of the crap on.
Yeah.
things.
Yeah.
Mm.
Oh. Yes.
And that's why we, for example, used, I was reading and deciphering basically, and the other person was writing. So we did it only once, we didn't do it again, but
Oh.
both writing.
Oh yeah.
So
Yeah.
we were all optimizing the time.
Yeah.
Very clever.
Very clever.
We were also thinking that maybe it was very beneficial for you to share because you had the knowledge. You were
Yeah.
that was part of our conversation.
Yeah, and they didn't know the background.
Yeah.
They didn't know how to utilize the data as well as you would because you know the case better.
Mhm.
So who was your partner then?
Mia.
Me, yeah, oh, you were too. Mary, yeah. Okay.
Yeah. Benefits of
My
collaboration.
partner had an exclusive contract, so he didn't even consider
You
the
were following the
possibility
rules.
to follow
It
to
could have
take
been
the
possible
rules.
without penalty.
No, this is a moral obligation.
Yeah, moral, exactly. There is a
You're
moral
seeing it.
penalty.
You're seeing
And you're
it.
sitting in a
That's
room
how
where
fish-
everyone will
that's
know.
how fish
Yeah.
It's
See now.
forbidden, it's forbidden, and
This is for Finns, you
Yeah.
know.
it doesn't matter whether there's a penalty or not. But it's still sin.
Yes.
Russians have their own word for Finnish people, and it means that Finns are so honest that they are stupid. And that word is trukna.
Oh, okay.
That's special for Finnish.
Yes. Well, that's how we acted anyway. So I worked on my own, not just following the rules. I think I still did pretty well, though. I'm forgetting what was my acronym.
What was your acronym?
People too.
You can do.
Oh,
Okay. Mm-hmm.
I think I was Granger's 1 or 2, but I'm forgetting which number.
So you didn't pay for the
I
data?
recall that it was
He didn't pay for the
Granger.
data.
Yeah.
He was the special expert
Yeah,
helping.
you used your expertise instead of paying.
Yeah.
All
We
right.
should have the names now, who was who, but we don't have anonymous.
Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah, but it was very intensive and like Joy said, very people were doing exactly what was asked from them, and
No.
so we had a very good experiment, and somebody said that we would like to do it again, so I did. Really?
Mm.
Well, I
Yeah,
mentioned
maybe.
that actually, that we are now, there is now this diploma thesis work starting with Cornell Corporation about data sharing in the ecosystem of a harbor. So they sell these crates to harbors, and there's plenty of other companies around, and there's benefits accruing potentially from sharing data across company borders. So in that kind of setting, it's still, well, I'm just wondering whether we would be able to do that in this kind of setting. But I think we are now, I'm sure many of us are now considering this kind of project, having learned from you how this kind of thing works and how it's set up. So let's see if you would like to repeat some sort of experiment. Then we of course want to collaborate, naturally share the results with you about how it's going to work.
Great. Yeah. Cool. And then, like, if we do make a computer version of it, then it'll be even easier to sort of replicate. Yeah.
Yeah. All right.
It would be interesting to see this kind of loss aversion impact, for example, with different values and so, like Kahneman logic in that sense, that if the risk is low, then it actually you don't see the loss aversion.
Yeah.
But then if you kind of go to, it depends on the value.
Yeah. Yeah. Mm-hmm.
By the way, I didn't like the Kahneman book so much because
I
most of the
like that.
time I was thinking that, okay, the guy is constructing this artificial setting and then he can say, haha, fool you again.
Yeah. Yeah.
So people are easy to fool when you devise a specific experiment to show
I
us
don't want to go
they are.
in his experiments, but the book was interesting.
The book is fun to read, but I wasn't fully convinced because I also sensed that, okay, if he has a point to prove, and then you can
You'll
always
find a way to do
test
it,
test a very specific text and the test that where people get fooled in a specific way, and
Yeah, experimental settings have shown to be, people behave very sensitively depending on how the experiment is run.
yes.
So that's a huge issue with experimental work. Yeah.
Well, my background is perhaps when 15 or 20 years ago we started doing this user interface studies with lab testing. So we did for a number of years testing experiments in laboratories. No usability testing, how people are using use systems, and what kind of errors they make, and how they reason about what they see and how they act, and that sort of stuff.
Mm-hmm.
And then with the somewhat better technology, then we moved to real life experiments. So we were able to put sensors on people's bodies and microphones and video cameras and whatnot, and do real world testing instead of laboratories. And then we found that there were quite a lot of different kind of biases that actually influence the lab tests.
Mm-hmm.
Maybe the key meaning that good part of the results are pretty much worthless.
Yeah.
Uh, At least I believe much better the experiments that we did in the real world.
Yeah, field experiments are extremely
Yes,
valuable for that.
they are valuable.
Yeah.
And so that makes me always a little bit suspicious about lab testing.
Mm-hmm.
There
Yeah.
are also biases there are so many biases that you can seep in even without the intent of the experimenter. And if the experimenter has a point to prove, then it's all too easy to conduct an experiment simply to prove that point. And
Yeah.
what does it show? We have a
Yeah.
circular argument.
Yeah, it's very
Almost-
easy. Yeah, even
almost
in giving instructions, like the way things are emphasized.
Yes.
Yeah.
So,
Yeah.
so beware.
Yes.
Beware when you read results of lab experiments,
Yeah.
at least in many contexts.
Mhm.
Not saying that this is bad, but well, you have to do something, and it's
Yeah.
much better to do this than simply wonder about that. Then, of course, it's even better if you could devise a way to do in some sense real world testing.
Yeah, real world testing and yeah.
But,
Yeah.
that is, of course, very, very difficult.
Mhm.
Take the results with a grain of salt.
Pardon?
Take the results with a grain of salt.
Yes, well,
So-
always, any science must be, of course, approached like that, but one must be aware of that. There are biases that so easily seep in.
Yeah.
But here we go, we do what we can, and this was a very interesting experience, certainly for us, and perhaps we will learn something.
So we'll go on then. So.
Great. Yeah, thank you so much for all the feedback and time in setting this up.
And it might
Yeah.
be that you will do a new experiment then back in
Yeah,
Cornell.
the hope is to
and
do
we
some
continue
student lab.
there
Yeah.
and with the
Yeah.
industrial people.
Yeah. Yeah.
Let's plan that.
Yeah.
Very good.
Yeah.
All
So
right,
it will
I
be
think
a
we have now,
collaboration.
we are clearly coming to the end of the session, and so perhaps we close this now officially, and we can stop recording or whatever is happening. And